This is David Barsamian, and my guest is Noura Erakat. She's an attorney, and she teaches international human rights law at Georgetown University. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
Well, in the wake of the Israeli attack on Gaza, Operation Cast Lead in late December 2008, in February 2009, you were part of a National Lawyers Guild mission to Gaza. Tell me about that. Why was it composed? What were your goals, and what did you learn?
The National Lawyers Guild delegation chose to travel to Gaza in the aftermath of Operation Cast Lead to investigate alleged war crimes committed by the Israeli army during the 22-day offensive. Our goals were three-part. We wanted to investigate the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, the illegal use of weapons, or alternatively, the use of legal weapons in illegal ways, and thirdly, the deliberate obstruction of medical personnel. All three actions constitute violations of international humanitarian law, otherwise known as the laws of war. And the National Lawyers Guild felt it imperative that we travel on our own fact-finding mission, self-funded, for 10 days, 6 days in Gaza specifically, because the United Nations did not generate its own investigation. And now that it has generated its own investigation, is facing opposition from Israel and is denied entry. And so we felt that as the Guild, being the first integrated legal association in the United States, and since then carrying the message of social, economic, and political justice, that it was part of our mission to investigate the alleged war crimes committed in Gaza.
And what did you find?
Unfortunately, we found violations on all three fronts. We found that the Israeli army indeed deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure, used white phosphorus, which is a legal weapon, but in illegal ways by targeting heavily residential populated areas, and also deliberately obstructed the movement of medical personnel, which hindered treatment of the sick and wounded, and in several cases that we documented, caused the death of many of the sick and wounded. In one case, a brother bled to death. A son of one of the men that we interviewed bled to death because an ambulance was denied to reach him for 23 hours. In another case, a woman's body laid for 12 hours without being picked up by an ambulance. And by the time the ambulance driver picked her up, she was stiff and swollen from death, still carrying the white scarf she had above her head to indicate her civilian status. It was quite atrocious what we found. And all of it indicates that there wasn't just a violation of laws of war, but there may have been something more egregious than that, and we encourage a United Nations investigation. Specifically, there is a principle called the distinction of proportionality, which obligates state parties who are engaged in warfare to not use military force more than that which is necessary to achieve their military goals. And what we found is that the force that was used was, in our estimation, based on our findings, used to inflict deliberate harm upon the civilians, as opposed to achieving Israel's military goals of stamping out Hamas.
Now, if a journalist landed from Mars, he or she might be quite struck by the enormous disparities in Israeli killed and wounded versus Palestinian killed and wounded. What are those numbers? And what does that indicate to you?
Sure. The Palestinian Center for Human Rights in Gaza City, which has many different offices within Gaza, estimates that there are over 1,400 Palestinians that were killed. Most of them are civilians. About 5,300 Palestinians were wounded. Alternatively, there have been 13 Israelis killed, a little bit more than 100 wounded. And of those 13 Israelis killed, 4 of them were killed in cross-friendly fire, meaning that the Israeli army shot their fellow soldiers. 4 of them were civilians, Israeli civilians. They had died from rocket attacks from Hamas. And that means that 5 Israeli soldiers were killed during this 22-day offensive. And without even investigating, The disparity in those numbers indicates several things. Firstly, that if only 5 Israeli soldiers were killed in what Israel regards as a sanctuary for Hamas fighters and militants, that means that whatever their fighting capabilities are, they're quite weak and negligible. If even with Israeli soldiers on the ground, more than thousands of them, that only 5 were killed. Secondly, it indicates that the weapons that the Israeli army was using were either not sophisticated or at least in their application were not applied with precision, but instead were applied in ways that killed the greatest number of people at one time. And if you think about just Gaza itself, the Gaza Strip is 365 square miles big. It's tiny. There's 1.5 million Palestinians living there, 3/4 of whom are refugees. Any bombing on any part of Gaza, any aerial bombing on any part of Gaza, will amount to unnecessary loss of civilian lives. And it's equivalent to, say, blowing up an entire New York City block, a densely populated block in Brooklyn or in Harlem or in the Bronx, in search of one criminal. And in our U.S. law, that's a violation of due process. And international law, that's a violation of both Article 33, which prohibits collective punishment of the Fourth Geneva Convention, as well as the principle of distinction, which obligates a warring state to distinguish between civilian and combatant.
What do you mean by 3/4 of the population of Gaza is refugee?
The Gaza Strip is home to about 750,000 Palestinian refugees. They became refugees in the aftermath of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. When the State of Israel was created, and mind you, this is a modern creation, although in our popular conception we conceive of this as a conflict from time immemorial between Muslims and Jews, and an ethnic conflict that's entrenched in hatred. That's not the case. In fact, if you consider the time of the establishment of Israel, it becomes very clear that its establishment is part of a colonial legacy, a settler colonial project that intended to create a state at the expense of the indigenous population. And so when the State of Israel was created, the Jewish Palestinian population owned 7% of what was historic Palestine. The Arab Palestinian, comprised of Muslims and Christians who lived in historic Palestine, owned 93% of the land. UN Partition Plan 181 proposed to give the Jewish Palestinians, who owned only 7%, 55% of the most fertile land of Palestine, and the Arab Palestinians to give them 45% of the less desirable parts of Palestine. The Arab leadership rejected the partition plan as a result of the disparity, and Israel was created as a result of war in what Israelis know as the War of Independence of May 1948, and which Palestinians have come to know as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, because it resulted in the dispossession and displacement of 700,000 of the 800,000 Palestinians within historic Palestine, and the demolition of 530 Palestinian homes, and really the absolute destruction of a Palestinian nation at the time. Those Palestinians that fled to Gaza, fled to the West Bank, fled to Syria, fled to Lebanon, fled to Jordan, fled to Egypt. And so the refugee population has since naturally grown as a result of natural population growth. And today in Gaza, 750,000 of them, of the 1.5 million Gazans, are refugees from that time.
Two questions about that. One, why would, if, as you say, Israel deliberately carried out attacks on civilians, number one, has that been corroborated by any other international agency, Amnesty or Human Rights Watch? And two, if it were the case, and concede the point that it is, why would Israel risk the tremendous opprobrium attached to that?
That's an excellent question. To answer the first part, yes, there have been several international reports that have found the same come to the same conclusions. Human Rights Watch conducted a report that found that the use of white phosphorus was indiscriminate and used in violation of international humanitarian law. They found casings and remains of white phosphorus throughout Gaza and residential areas, and have offered that Israel, to achieve its military purposes, had alternatives for the white phosphorus as a smokescreen, had less harmful smokescreens at its disposal that it could have used but did not use. Amnesty International also conducted an investigation and found that significant laws of war were violated or significant violations of laws of war were committed, and has called for an arms embargo by the U.S. of all arms sales to Hamas and Israel. Of course, the U.S. doesn't provide arms to Hamas, so that doesn't amount to much. But in terms of Israel, the U.S. provides about $3 billion worth of military and economic aid to Israel. And so there's a significant action that can be taken there. Physicians for Human Rights, which is an Israeli human rights group, conducted its own investigation and found that there was indeed deliberate obstruction of the movement of medical personnel, meaning the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Palestinian Red Crescent Society. Those, about 7 ambulance drivers were targeted and killed, and dozens, if not hundreds, of ambulances were also targeted, meaning that the organs and the tools that are used to treat the wounded and the sick during war were debilitated. And so the wounded and the sick, already vulnerable and exposed in this war, didn't have any type of access to humanitarian care. And consider that this is compounded by the fact that hospitals were also destroyed by Israel during the attack. And of course, the army explains that there were weapons stored in the hospitals, leaving these Palestinian civilians almost nowhere to go because the borders were sealed. And so they were forced to become either survivors or victims. And secondly, nowhere to hide because the UN compounds that offered shelter were also destroyed, as well as schools, and nowhere to be treated because hospitals and ambulances were targeted. Now, and then of course, what's not international, but which comes from the Israeli army itself, is the Israeli military. In an Israeli Military Institute debrief, there were several soldiers who corroborated these stories when they confessed, as a result of the tremendous amount of moral complexity that they were feeling, or moral predicament that they were in, that they had shot at defenseless civilians, at women, mothers with their children, because they were told to shoot to kill, or to shoot without care. Of course, the Israeli military has since covered this up and said that those cases are not true, that the most egregious case was a soldier firing deliberately at a woman at her knee, and that's what caused her suffering, but has covered up the other stories. So why, in light of all of these stories from international human rights organizations, the Israeli human rights organizations, from the Israeli soldiers themselves, would Israel feel comfortable enough not to hide any of these stories? I mean, it did try to hide them by imposing a media blackout, allowing no journalists into the region at the time. But
into Gaza,
yes, it actually expelled all media. CNN, Reuters, AP, Agence France Presse, even Fox were expelled from expelled from Gaza at the time.
I think Jazeera was reporting from inside Gaza.
Jazeera remained inside, and Jazeera remained inside, of course, at its own risk, and was one of the only media outlets that was able to report from the ground. But as we know in the U.S., Jazeera is hardly credible, but for the rest of the world that was bearing witness to what cameras were capturing, it was quite chilling and real. So why would Israel do this? Specifically because it can. Israel has operated with a significant amount of impunity provided by the U.S. for decades. As a permanent member of the Security Council, the U.S. has vetoed almost all Security Council resolutions that criticized Israel or have called for investigations, thereby shielding Israel from any type of investigation, including most recently, the Operation Defensive Shield, the incursion into the West Bank in 2002, and the Jenin refugee camp, the tragedy that happened there. But it also prohibited any type of investigation into southern Lebanon and in the war on Hezbollah, or really the war on all of Lebanon in June 2006. And the U.S. continues to provide Israel with this type of impunity, shielding it from all criticism It has, in the middle of these atrocities, in mid-January, U.S. Congress passed H.Res. 34 almost unanimously. Only 5 nay votes, 22 abstentions, and the rest were yea votes that affirmed that this operation represented Israel's right to defend itself and blamed all deaths and carnage within Gaza on Hamas. And because of this, really now Israel can even reject a United Nations mission headed by the esteemed South African Jewish jurist Richard Goldstone, who has called not just for an investigation into Israel's war crimes, but into Hamas's war crimes as well. Hamas has agreed to such an investigation, and Israel refuses to allow them entry. And the U.S. applies absolutely no pressure on Israel to change or alter its behavior. And so for that reason, we see it acting in arrogant ways in blatant contravention of international law.
The narratives between the two communities is so radically different. The Israelis say we left Gaza in 2005. Since then, we've been attacked by Hamas, their rockets. We have a right to self-defense. We repeatedly warned Hamas to stop rocketing civilians and cities and towns in southern Israel. They refused. So in self-defense, we had to stop that rocketing. And when Barack Obama, when he was campaigning for president, visited Sderot in southern Israel, he said, if pointing to a house and saying, if my daughters were sleeping in there and were subjected to rocket attacks, I would certainly, defend myself.
Absolutely. And every nation has the right to defend itself and to use military force to do so. But every nation is also obligated to abide by laws of war. Laws of war were created both to regulate warfare as well as to protect civilians. So while Israel has the right to use military force in order to protect itself, it does not have the right to blatantly disregard laws of war, deliberately target civilians, use legal weapons in illegal ways, and obstruct the movement of medical personnel. As for the narratives, here I disagree. You mentioned that there's a gap. I agree that there's a gap. And what I hold to be true and what I encourage others to investigate themselves by either investigating whatever records are available as well as, and in the best case, to travel to the region themselves, is that Gaza was never free. The occupation never ended. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, meaning it dismantled its 21 settlements. It withdrew its 8,000 settler population. Its 12,000 settler population, but it maintained its control over all of Gaza's borders, over its airspace, over its seaport, over the ingress and egress of all commodities, meaning it controlled the economy. It maintained control over the movement of Palestinians in and out of Gaza, and it retained the right to reinvade at any point that it deemed necessary for its security. In effect, Gazans remained under the control of Israel, an Israeli prerogative. So that's one piece. But it gets worse. In January 2006, the Bush administration compelled the Palestinians to enter into Palestinian Legislative Council elections, which they were not prepared to do. And the Hamas overwhelmingly won those elections. And they won not because the Palestinians voted for an Islamic state and therefore voted for Hamas, but instead they were voting against the failed peace process. It was a referendum for them to vote against the failed peace process that had facilitated the further confiscation of their land. They were voting against Fatah's corruption. And they were also voting for Hamas in many ways because Hamas was providing social services in the form of education, health, food to a people without a state and therefore no state institutions to provide these services themselves. Add to that Fatah committed several political blunders and that they didn't even know how to run their own campaign and oftentimes ran more than one Fatah candidate in municipalities where Hamas only ran one candidate. And so as a result, Hamas came to power and immediately the EU, the United States, and Israel rejected the democratic elections and imposed a blockade on the Gaza Strip. really imposed a blockade actually on all of Palestine. At that point, there hadn't been the schism between the West Bank and Gaza.
And under international law, blockades constitute collective punishment.
Absolutely. Unless, and it's still questionable, but unless the Security Council votes to sanction a nation, in which case this type of collective punishment becomes legal, a euphemism. I hardly agree. But if that's the case, in that case it would be legal. But in the case of this blockade, which limited food, bread, water, bread, rice, water, sanitation equipment, medical supplies, all other forms of food. It debilitated the economy so that truckloads of vegetables and produce were stuck at the borders. And so Gazans who normally had an income no longer had that sort of income. It plummeted the economy and created a almost 50% unemployment rate and a condition where 86% of Gaza's 1.5 million population, and as I mentioned, 3/4 of whom are refugees, were dependent on food aid for survival. In January 2008, Israel made it worse by limiting fuel into Gaza, literally plunging regions of Gaza into darkness, making hospitals completely ineffective, shutting down water generators and sanitation, which would otherwise sanitize water. We're talking about what many humanitarian organizations, including Oxfam, UNRWA, other UN International Committee for the Red Cross, called not a humanitarian crisis, but a humanitarian catastrophe. Notwithstanding this catastrophe, notwithstanding these horrible conditions under which Palestinians in Gaza were living under, in June 2008, Hamas negotiated with Israel, the Egyptian brokered ceasefire, to enter into a 6-month ceasefire, to cease its rocket fire in exchange for Israel ceasing its attacks as well as easing the blockade. And according to John Ging, the Gaza director of the United Nations Relief Works Agency, during that time, Hamas rocket fire decreased significantly. It may not have become zero, but it decreased significantly. On the other hand, the blockade wasn't eased a single bit. And on November 4th, the Israeli army violated that ceasefire and shattered it when they entered into Gaza and killed 6 Palestinians who they claim are militants. But whether they're militants or civilians is really neither here nor there. It was a violation of the ceasefire and compounded by the other violations of not easing the blockade, so on and so forth, and hence the disintegration of this ceasefire, which offered a lot of hope. It offered Israel, I think, more security than it had achieved by any other means diplomatically. Let me add to that notwithstanding the November 4th attack, in the LA Times, right before the beginning of Operation Cast Lead, Hamas published an op-ed that publicly stated it was willing to renew the ceasefire and to enter into negotiations for 2 states.
November 4th, incidentally, was a date when Americans and most of the world's attention was focused on a particular election in the United States. Now, the U.S. has set preconditions for recognizing Hamas and for lifting the blockade. Among them are renunciation of violence, agreeing Hamas to agree to all previous agreements signed by the PLO and the PA, and to recognize Israel's right to exist. Now, this Israel's right to exist is something that is invented by Henry Kissinger in the early 1970s. It really has no basis in international law. I mean, how can you recognize a country's right to exist? What does that mean? What is your understanding of that?
Well, actually, in international law, there is protection for self-determination of nations. There's also the protection for state sovereignty and whatever that looks like. So states have significant amount of rights in international law. That said, the use of the right to exist of Israel has been used, I think, quite irresponsibly in this situation, because the right to exist. Every nation has the right to exist, including the Palestinian nation, the Lebanese nation, the Syrian nation. All these nations have the right to exist. And we're not talking about the Israelis' right to exist as a nation, or as a Jewish people within that nation. This is really about Israel's right, and what Henry Kissinger is really referring to is Israel's right to act with impunity in the region. So Israel continues to maintain an occupation. Occupations are meant to last for only a short period of time in order to account for a transition, or to make for a peaceful transition between wartime and peacetime. And that's why we have laws of occupation in the Fourth Geneva Conventions, really all the Geneva Conventions. But Israel has maintained the longest lasting occupation, which we have now come to know as a prolonged occupation, which has shifted even what it may mean to occupy, because these structural inequalities have destroyed the economy and reshaped the identity of Palestinians. And as Israel continues to occupy the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, as it continues to deny the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their original homelands as enshrined by UN Resolution 194, in response to its occupation, which is incredibly violent, and as we saw in Gaza, is very violent, and as we witnessed in East Jerusalem, it leads to the Judaization of East Jerusalem. There are laws that are used that are we would deem ridiculous. So laws that say if you aren't in Jerusalem, if you don't sleep in Jerusalem for a certain amount of time, then you can lose your Jerusalem residency rights. Except Palestinian men living in Jerusalem who can't get jobs in Jerusalem work outside in surrounding cities, but because of blockades, checkpoints, and other impediments, can't get back into Jerusalem and back into their jobs, and effectively lose their residency rights. So it's not by circumstance or choice, but it's a forcible denial of the residency rights, and therefore the revocation of them. And this has resulted in what's become the Judaization of East Jerusalem. In the West Bank, we've borne witness to the expansion of settlements, which even the U.S. government has deemed illegal. It is illegal under international law. International law prohibits the transfer of one civilian population into its occupied territory. The U.S. has said that it will reduce its aid package to Israel by the amount that the Israeli government spends on settlement expansion. That said, the Israeli government continues to expand its settlements. Netanyahu plans to expand its settlements now around Jerusalem by 73,300 settlements, amounting to 100% settler population increase. To do that, it must confiscate Palestinian lands. Once it confiscates this Palestinian lands, it must build bypass roads in order to ensure that its settlers, who are now deemed as what they are, unwelcomed guests on this land, their own roads to travel on, which are roads for Jews only and are indicated by different colored license plates, green versus yellow. I mean, we're talking about very blatant discrimination, separation based on race and ethnic grounds, which would amount to apartheid, which is another conversation. But all that to say that here we witness the structural violence of occupation happening daily. And under international law, all nations have a right to their self-determination and can use force in order to acquire that self-determination. And in response, of course, Israel responds that this is not Palestinian resistance in order to ensure their self-determination, but instead Palestinian attacks on Israel's right to exist, which are two completely different things. The right to exist is not in question. It's the right to be able to violate international law with impunity that's in question.
We just have a minute left. What can people do who are interested in learning more about the situation or getting actively involved?
There's several things that you can do. I encourage you to visit the website of the American Association for Palestinian Equal Rights, or AAPER.org. There's a lot of information there, ways that you can host your own educational and outreach events in your cities. But in addition to that, there's campaigns that you can participate in, including the Gaza human rights campaigns, where you can call for, you can visit your member of Congress and actually request an investigation into Israel's use of U.S. supplied weapons and whether or not those use complied with the provisions of U.S. laws controlling the use of those weapons, particularly the Arms Export Control Act. I encourage you to visit that website, www.aaper.org.
I've been talking to Noura Erakat. She's an attorney, and she teaches international human rights law at Georgetown University. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, David.
I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening.